Welcome back to JavaScript Fundamentals. This is day 4, and today we're going to talk about functions. Every day thus far we have used functions. We have used the alert function to pop up a window within the browser. We also looked at the parseInt and the parseFloat functions to convert strings to numbers. But you might even still be thinking, well, what really is the purpose of a function? Well, consider the parseInt function. It processes a string to convert it to a number. And let's say that this process takes, 15 lines of code. Every time that we would want to convert a string to a number, we would have to write those 15 lines of code if we didn't have a function to do so. So not only would our code get longer to type, it would also be more error prone because we are, after all, human. We are going to make mistakes as we are typing code. So naturally, the longer our code is, the more likely we are to have an error, a typo, or forgetting to do a certain process, what have you, it would be an error. So this is why functions were created, so that we can reuse pieces of code anytime that we wanted to. And thankfully, we're not limited to just the built-in functions. We can write our own so that we can reuse our own code. For example, I have essentially 6 lines of code. They're broken into 2 sets of 3 lines, but they perform the same operations except for one small difference. The foo variable is starting off with a value of 2, and the bar variable is starting off with a value of 3. Other than that, they're performing the same operations. They're adding this initial value to the number 3, then adding 1 to it, and then multiplying by 8. And let's go ahead and fill this out. So we'll have 5, which is initially assigned to foo, and then we'll add 1 to it, which is 6. Then we'll multiply that by 8, which is 48. And by the way, what I'm doing here is taking the value of foo, which at this time is 5. We're adding 1 to 5 and then assigning a new value to foo. So we are modifying the value that foo contains. It no longer contains 5, it contains 6. So in line 4, whenever we execute this line of code, the value of foo is 6, so it's 6 times 8, which is 48, and then that value is assigned to foo. So foo is now 48. And we do the same thing for the bar. We start off with 3 plus 3, which is 6. Then we add 1, which is 7. Then we multiply that by 8, which is 56. So the idea of this code is that we are doing the same set of operations over and over again. We've only done it twice, once for foo and once for bar, but we might want to perform these same operations for other values. So it would make sense to refactor this code into a function. And by refactor, I basically mean rewriting to make it more simplified or more maintainable. So we want to refactor this code into a function so that instead of using 3 lines of code to add 3 and then to add 1 and then to multiply by 8, we could just call the function and do that in 1 line of code. So let's write a function that does this. And to do so, we use a keyword called function. And then we need a name for our function because just like variables, we need some way to refer to this function within our code. And we do need to follow the same naming guidelines as variables. So use camel casing. I'm just going to call this function do something because, well, I don't really have a good name to give it as to what it is that it does. And then we have a set of parentheses after the function name. Now we're going to put something called a parameter here in a moment, but go ahead and just put a set of parentheses, and then we have a set of curly braces. This is marking the beginning and the ending of the function. And that means any code that we put in between the opening curly brace and the closing curly brace is part of the function body. So that code will execute whenever we call the do something function. Now, a moment ago, I mentioned something about parameters. As it is right now, the do something function does not accept any parameters, so it doesn't accept any external data. And that's fine. There are some functions that don't need external data in order to work. But in our case, we do need that because we have an initial value. Foo started with the value of 2, and bar started with the value of 3, so that we need to provide that data to the do something function so that it can perform the necessary operation operations with that starting value. And to do that, we use a parameter. A parameter is a special variable for a function. It's usable inside of the opening and closing curly brace, but it cannot be used outside of the function that it was defined in. And to define a parameter, all we have to do is type a name in between the opening and closing parentheses. We don't have to use the var keyword. All we have to do is simply type a name. So I'm going to call this param1, and this will allow us to pass data to this do something function so that we can work with it. Now all we need to do is replicate the operations that we want to perform. So instead of using foo or bar, we will use param1 inside of the function. So param1 equals, and param1 is the starting value, so we'll do param1 plus 3, and then we'll do param1 equals param1 plus 1, param1 equals param1 times 8. So we should be able to run the do something function, pass 2 for foo, pass 3 for bar, and get 48 and 56 respectively. So let's go ahead and do that. So do something, we'll pass 3, that should give us 56. And then for foo, do something, pass in 2, that should give us 48. And also, let's alert these values. So alert foo, alert bar. I also need an HTML page to run this script, so I will create one right fast. And inside of body, we'll create script, source. This is script.js. And now all we have to do is run it. Now this actually isn't going to work. We are going to get undefined. There we go. And undefined. Well, why are we getting undefined? Because we did accept a value and we did modify it, but the do something function is not returning a value. Yes, it is modifying the value that we have supplied the function, but it doesn't return the new value to whatever called it. So to do that, we use the return keyword and then the value that we want to return. Now, without the return keyword, a function is going to return undefined. That's why we got undefined whenever we ran the code the first time. But now we are returning a value. We are returning param1 to whatever calls it. So in the case of line 2 with foo, we are calling do something, passing the value of 2. It's going to perform these operations, and then it's going to return the new value to the foo variable. Same thing for bar, except with the number 3. So let's go back to the browser, let's refresh, and we should see 48, and then 56. So that's pretty easy. Let's make this just a little bit more complicated. Let's add another parameter to this function. To do that, use a comma, and then the name of your other parameter. I'm going to call this param2. And you can have as many parameters that you need. All you have to do is separate them by commas. So we could have param3 or param4. Whatever we need, we could do that. I'm just going to stick with 2 parameters. And let's use this second parameter and multiply the final result by it. So we can pass in 2 parameters. We'll do 2. That's easy to do. So we are going to perform the same set of operations, but then the return value is going to be the modified value that we have supplied multiplied by param2. In this case, we are doubling it. So this will be 96, and this will be 112. So let's go back to the browser and run it. There we go, 96 and 112. One of the cool things about JavaScript is that functions are values. There is a function data type in JavaScript, and since they are values, you can assign them to variables. And that might sound kind of weird at first, but this is one of the reasons why JavaScript is such a powerful programming language, because we can create functions and assign them to other variables. So let's rewrite this function, because we can. We've used function declaration syntax. We have declared the function using the function keyword followed by the name of the function. But we can actually get rid of the function name. And earlier I said that a function needs a name in order for us to execute it multiple times. Well, that is perfectly true. But this is what's called an anonymous function. And while it might seem useless, you will use anonymous functions very frequently in your code. And in fact, we will use them throughout this course. But this is an anonymous function, but we can also assign a function to a variable. So instead of having a useless function that we cannot call, we have assigned it to a variable, and this makes this variable usable as a function. Now, if we try to run this code, we're not going to get the same results as we did before. In fact, I'm going to pull up the developer console, which if you're on Windows is Control-Shift-I. I don't know what the keystrokes are for Macintosh or Linux. I apologize. But Control-Shift-I brings up the developer console. If you press Escape, that will pull up the JavaScript console. And this is giving us the errors in this page. And it says that there's a type error that do something is not a function. Now, there's some other technical stuff going on here. We'll just ignore that. But it's basically saying that it cannot find a function called do something. Well, this particular issue is caused by something called hoisting. I'm not going to get into hoisting today because there are some other topics we need to cover, but we can easily solve this issue by cutting and pasting the do something function to the top of the file. So if we go back to the browser and refresh, we get our code working like it did before. Now, since we can assign a function to a variable, you might ask the question, well, can we pass a function to another function? The answer would be yes. So let's add another parameter here. We'll call this fn, short for function. And instead of multiplying param1 by param2, let's actually call the function that's being passed to do something. And then it will then pass the param1 and param2 to do something with. So whenever we call do something, we need to supply a third parameter, a function, to do something with these two values. So let's write some functions using function declaration syntax. Actually, we could use anonymous functions here, but it can look a little weird, and I would prefer to be somewhat clear, especially since we're passing functions to other functions, which can be weird in its own right. So by using function declaration syntax, it's just a little bit clearer. So let's call one function sum. It needs to accept a parameter. We can call this param1, param2 if we want to. They don't have to be the same names as the values being passed to them. It doesn't matter. I'm just doing so for continuity reasons. And then we need to return param1 plus param2. Even though we've created the sum function using function declaration syntax, we can still use it as a value. All we have to do is use the name of the function. We don't want to execute it with the parentheses after, we just want the name of the function because that gives us the value of that function. So whenever we call do something and we want to pass the sum function to it, we just simply pass sum. Let's create another function. We'll call this one product, and it needs two parameters. So param1, param2, and then we just simply want to return param1 multiplied by param2. So we're going to get the same result as we did before. We are just doing so in a more complex way. So whenever we create the bar variable, let's pass product. And whenever we run this within the browser, we will get 50 for foo because we changed that from a multiplication to addition. And then we will get the same value, 112, for bar. And just so that you can see what it would look like using an anonymous function, let's get rid of our product function. We'll just cut and paste into our code here so that we are using the anonymous function and passing that function itself as the argument. And whenever we run this again, we will get the same exact results that we got before, 50 and then 112. And just so that you can see what's going on, we are passing 3 and then 2, and then we are passing the function to do something. So instead of using the name of a function, because we don't have one for multiplying param1 and param2, because I got rid of it, we are passing the function itself. So this is one place where we could use an anonymous function. And whenever we talk about events many days later, we will use a lot of anonymous functions. So that, in about a 15-minute nutshell, is the function data type. We just barely scratched the surface on functions, but in this course we are going to stick to the basics. We'll save the more advanced stuff for a more advanced course. Just remember that we use functions to reuse code, but also remember that they are more than that. They are values, and we can use them as variables, or we can use them by passing them to other functions. So with that, we will close for today. Have a good one, and I will see you next time.